Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. For me, sleep paralysis was never a mystery, but a tedious medical condition I had learned to live with. The first time it happened, when I was 15, was the worst. Waking up in the middle of the night, my eyes open, but my body petrified, feeling an invisible weight on my chest that stole my breath was an experience of pure, animalistic terror. I screamed, or tried to scream, but only a choked groan escaped my throat. On that occasion, I watched the shadows in my room twist and conspire against me. When I could finally move a finger and then an arm, breaking the spell, I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed with all the lights on. Over the years, however, the episodes became routine. I learned to identify the lead-up, an electric buzzing in my ears just before falling asleep, or a sensation of falling very fast despite being horizontal. When the paralysis set in, my mind no longer panicked. It had become an exercise in patience. I remember a time in college when I tried to fight it. I believed that if I focused all my willpower, I could break the bonds by force. It was a catastrophic mistake. My resistance only intensified the hallucinations. The buzzing became a deafening roar. The weight on my chest threatened to crush me, and the shadows didn't just twist. They seemed to boil and climb the walls. That futile struggle taught me the most important lesson. The only way to win was not to play. Surrender, calm, and waiting were my only weapons. I even got used to the recurring hallucination, the one that books and internet forums called the Hat Man, or the Shadow People. In my case, it was a tall, thin figure, a patch of darkness denser than the darkness of the night itself, that usually appeared in the farthest corner of my room, by the window. It didn't move. It was just there, a statue of silence and blackness. I learned to ignore it. Sometimes, while waiting for my body to respond, I would observe my visitor with a kind of clinical curiosity. Its shape was always the same, its edges undefined, like black smoke frozen in time. It was my cellmate in those minutes that stretched into eternity, a defective product of my own frightened mind. I always repeated that to myself. It's a product of my mind. It's not real. And when the paralysis dissolved, the figure vanished with it without a trace. The night everything changed didn't start any differently than the others. I went to bed feeling tired, but not exhausted. I remember it was raining outside, a rhythmic, gentle sound against the window pane. I fell asleep quickly, but something jolted me awake. It wasn't a noise. It was the silence. The rain had stopped, and the absence of its sound woke me, or so I thought. I tried to turn to look at the clock, and I couldn't. The old familiar invisible corset held me fast. My body was a stone. The weight on my chest was there, punctual as always. The familiar buzzing vibrated inside my skull. Here we are again, I thought, with a mental sigh. Just breathe deep and wait. I opened my eyes. The room was bathed in a grayish gloom, barely lit by the streetlights filtering through the blinds. And, as always, in the corner by the window, was my visitor. The tall, dark silhouette was framed against the dim light. Everything in order, everything according to the script. But this time, something was different. The sense of oppression was more intense, the silence in the room deeper, denser. It wasn't an empty silence, but a silence full of something, an expectation. I looked at the figure, waiting for the minutes to pass. But it didn't stay still. It began to move. My trained composure shattered in an instant. The terror I hadn't felt since I was a teenager returned with the force of a cyclone. The figure didn't walk. It glided. It detached from the corner with a fluid, unnatural movement, as if unaffected by friction or gravity. It had no feet. Its base simply flowed over the wooden floor without making the slightest sound. It crossed the space between us with a deliberate, torturous slowness. With its movement, it brought a change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, and a subtle smell of ancient dust and ozone, like a freshly opened crypt, filled my nostrils. Every inch it drew closer was a new wave of panic crashing against my mind. I wanted to scream, to close my eyes, to truly wake up. But my body was a prison and my eyelids were nailed open. It stopped right beside my bed. I could see it more clearly now, though clearly was a relative term. It had no face, no clothes, no features. It was an absence of light, a hole in reality vaguely shaped like a human. I felt a cold emanating from it that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was a cold that seeped into my bones, a cold that felt like death itself. The figure leaned over me. The blackness loomed over my face, and though it had no eyes, I felt it was studying me, looking at me with an intensity that pierced my skin. Not real, not real, not real, my mind repeated, but the words had no power anymore. My heart was beating with a violence that felt like it would break my ribs. Then, it raised what appeared to be an arm, a long, thin extension of the same darkness. It moved toward my shoulder, descending slowly. The panic reached a level I had never known. I knew, with a primitive and absolute certainty, that I must not let it touch me. I fought against my own muscles with all the force of my will. I tried to move a finger, a muscle in my face, anything to break the connection. The shadow's arm was just inches away. I could feel the cold intensifying on my skin, even without contact. And then, it touched me. It wasn't a touch. It was like being stabbed with a piece of ice forged in the void. A sharp, freezing, piercing pain shot into my shoulder. It was a real, physical, undeniable pain. The sensation was so brutal, so alien to anything I had ever experienced, that the jolt of pure shock and agony was enough. The spell broke. With a violent gasp that tore at my throat, I regained control of my body. I shot up, screaming, and scrambled backward on the bed until I hit the headboard. My hand instinctively went to my shoulder, which was burning and aching with an impossible cold. The room was empty. The figure was gone. The only presence was my own, that of a man shaking uncontrollably in the darkness. I fumbled for the bedside lamp and switched it on. Yellow light flooded the room, banishing the shadows to their proper places. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The chair, the wardrobe, the window. Everything was as it always was. I sat there for almost an hour, my heart racing, trying to process what had happened. A part of my mind, the rational part that had been my shield for years, desperately tried to find an explanation. It was a tactile hallucination, a more vivid nightmare than usual. The pain was psychosomatic, a creation of my panic, but the pain didn't go away. It was a dull, cold throbbing in my left shoulder. I got out of bed, still trembling, and walked like an automaton to the bathroom. I needed to see myself in the mirror to see that there was nothing there, that it had all been a fabrication. I turned on the bathroom light, blinding myself for a second. I looked in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear. With my right hand, I pulled down the collar of my t-shirt to expose my aching shoulder. My breath stopped. My blood turned to ice. On my skin, right where I had felt the apparition's touch, there was a mark. It wasn't a scratch or a cut. It was the print of a hand. It was perfectly defined, with the palm and 5 long, thin fingers imprinted on my skin. The mark wasn't red like a blow, or purple like a bruise. It was a dark, almost black color, as if the skin had been necrosed by frostbite. And as I stared at it, terrified through the mirror, I saw something that defied all logic. The skin around the mark was covered by a very thin layer of white frost, which glistened for an instant under the light before evaporating. I touched the print with the fingers of my other hand. It was ice cold, not cool, but freezing, as if I had just touched a block of ice. A sharp pain shot through my arm. I stood there, staring at my reflection, and the truth fell upon me with the weight of a tombstone. For years I had told myself it wasn't real. I had been wrong. The paralysis wasn't the cage that imprisoned me. It was the cage that imprisoned it. And that night, for the first time, my visitor had found a way to open the door. I stood before the mirror, paralyzed for a second time that night, but this time it was from the sheer impact of the revelation. The man in the reflection was a stranger, pale and with terror etched on every feature. The mark on my shoulder was the irrefutable proof, the seal of a boundary that had been breached. There was no longer any refuge in logic or psychology. The thing in my room was not a hallucination. It was a real thing, and it had marked me as its own. The rest of the night I spent in the living room, with every light in the house on. I sat on the sofa, hugging my knees, jumping at every creak of the building, every sound from the street. Sleep was an enemy, a territory I no longer dared to enter. Every time my eyelids grew heavy, the image of the figure leaning over me returned with brutal clarity, and the jolt of adrenaline woke me again. I watched as the night slowly turned into the gray gloom of dawn, feeling like the sole survivor of a shipwreck. With the daylight, a part of me hoped the mark would have disappeared, that it had all been the climax of a feverish nightmare. But no. When I looked in the mirror, the handprint was still there, dark and sharp against my skin. The pain had subsided, but the area was still strangely cold to the touch, as if a piece of ice were lodged under my skin. That day I moved through the world like a ghost. I went out into the street, hoping the normality of daytime life, the noise of traffic and people, could exorcise the horror of the night. It was useless. I felt disconnected, like I was seeing the world through glass. Every long shadow in an alley, every dark corner, sent a chill down my spine. At one point, passing a shop window, I thought I saw it. For a fraction of a second, in the reflection, I saw a tall, thin silhouette standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There was no one there. I told myself it was suggestion, nerves, lack of sleep. But doubt was now a poison spreading through my veins. The real test came at nightfall. The thought of going back to my bedroom, to that room, was unbearable. I decided I would try to sleep on the sofa, with the television on for some light and noise. I thought if I avoided the darkness and silence of my room, perhaps I could avoid the paralysis. For hours I stared at the screen, watching mindless shows without registering a thing, fighting the weight of exhaustion. Eventually, sleep overcame me. I don't know how long I slept, but it wasn't paralysis that woke me. It was, again, the cold. An intense cold that was chilling me to the bone despite being covered with a blanket. I opened my eyes. The television was still on, casting a flickering blue light. And in the middle of the living room, between the sofa and the TV, it stood. It was standing there, motionless, just like in the corner of my bedroom. A column of blackness that absorbed the flickering light from the screen. I was awake, fully awake and conscious, and the thing was still there. The terror was so absolute that it took my breath away. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, not because of paralysis, but from sheer fright. We were on the same plane of reality. There was no longer a threshold separating us. I looked away for a second, a reflex of denial, and when I looked back, it was gone. It had vanished. But it took several minutes for the cold to dissipate. The message was clear. It no longer needed me to be asleep. The cage was broken, and now it could move freely in my world. After that night, I refused to be a passive victim. A survival instinct drove me to try to fight back, to reclaim my territory. Over the next few days, I conducted my own desperate secular exorcism. I opened all the windows, letting the afternoon sunlight flood every corner. I did a deep clean, scrubbing floors and walls as if I could wash away its presence with soap. I even bought salt and sprinkled it across the thresholds of doors and windows, feeling ridiculous, but more scared than ashamed. I was trying to reassert that this was my house, my space. For a brief moment, with the sun streaming in and the smell of clean in the air, I almost convinced myself it had worked. I felt a glimmer of hope. It was then, in the middle of the sun-drenched living room, that it appeared again, more defiant than ever. It didn't hide in a shadowy corner. It materialized in the center of the room, a perfectly black silhouette against the bright sunlight. Its presence seemed to mock my efforts, proving to me that light didn't affect it, that salt was just a seasoning, and that my home was as much its as it was mine. It stood there for almost a minute, an unbearably long time, before vanishing. Hope shattered. I understood that the rules of old ghost stories didn't apply to it. It wasn't bound to darkness or dirt. It was bound to me. From that failure on, its audacity grew. It began to interact with my life. One day, I found the only photo I have of my parents in the living room turned face down. When I turned it over, the glass of the frame was so cold it almost stuck to my fingers. One afternoon, while trying to relax listening to music with headphones, the melody distorted and was replaced by a low, static hiss, a white noise that felt organic and threatening, like the breathing of a giant insect. I ripped the headphones from my ears, my heart hammering. It was invading my memories, my refuges, desecrating every small corner of my life that gave me comfort. I felt trapped, stalked by a silent, malevolent entity. I started talking to myself, leaving all the lights on even during the day, playing music constantly to break the silence that seemed to attract it. But nothing worked. It was as if it was feeding on my fear and my exhaustion, and with each passing day, it grew stronger, more present. The final confrontation came a week after the first touch. I hadn't slept more than an hour at a time for days. My body and mind were at their breaking point. I was sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m, all the lights on, drinking a coffee that no longer had any effect. Suddenly I felt the temperature in the room plummet. I could see my breath. I looked up. It wasn't in a corner or down the hall. It was standing on the other side of the kitchen table, less than 2 meters away from me. Sharper, denser, and darker than ever before. I could feel the waves of cold emanating from it. We stared at each other. Me, a trembling wreck of a man, and it, an unfathomable void. In that moment, I knew I couldn't keep running. It was in my kitchen, in bright light, watching me. There was nowhere left to escape. Either madness would consume me, or I had to do something. A strange calm, the calm of absolute desperation, came over me. I set my mug on the table. The sound of ceramic against wood was the only noise in a sepulchral silence. I stared at it, at the absence of a face before me, and in a hoarse voice, trembling from disuse, I asked, "What do you want from me?" There was no audible response. But the instant I spoke those words, an avalanche of sensations and knowledge that were not my own flooded my mind. They weren't thoughts. They were pure, brutal feelings. I could see, or rather, feel its existence, an eternity floating in a gray void, a threshold without sound, color, texture, or time. I felt a loneliness so vast and ancient it made my own life seem like a fleeting, brilliant blink. Then I felt its hunger, a desperate and voracious need, not for food but for experience. I could see my own world through its senses. The red of the mug on the table was a painfully intense explosion. The hum of the refrigerator was a complex symphony. The warmth of my body was a comforting sun. It was a prisoner looking at a vibrant world through a keyhole, and it saw me, not as a victim, but as the keyhole itself, as the door. I understood that it didn't want to kill me. It wanted something much worse. It wanted to peer into the world through my eyes, to use my body as an anchor, so it would never have to return to the silent, empty nothingness from which it came. The wave of sensations ceased as quickly as it had begun. The figure vanished, leaving me alone in the freezing kitchen, trembling, but with a terrible and clear understanding of my new reality. I haven't tried to fight it again. I've accepted my condition. I am no longer just a man. I am a beacon, a bridge between two worlds. The visitor is still here. I feel it sometimes, like a cold draft in a closed room, or I see it, a fleeting shadow at the edge of my vision. The sleep paralysis still happens, and on those occasions it sometimes approaches the bed and simply watches, as if guarding its anchor, its window to existence. It doesn't touch me anymore. It doesn't need to. I have learned to live with a ghost at my back, to never be truly alone. I've come to understand that the real horror isn't the monster that attacks you in the dark. It's the one that moves in with you, silently, and condemns you to a life where every shadow is a doubt and every silence is a presence. The door that opened that night can never be closed, and I am condemned to live standing in the threshold forever. The silence of an empty apartment is different from that of any other place. After the separation, I needed exactly that. A place that didn't have echoes of past laughter or the imprint of a shared life. A space where I could breathe without feeling the weight of memories. The last day in our old house was an ordeal of cardboard boxes and evasive glances. The breakup had been a slow erosion, my need for order and control clashing with her free and spontaneous spirit. Living with you is like living in a museum, she told me once, and that phrase became the crack that finally broke everything. As I closed the door on that life for the last time, I felt a mixture of panic and unexpected relief. Hours later, I opened the door to my new home. I chose an apartment in a newly constructed building, on the 14th floor. It was a minimalist, almost sterile space. White walls, a parquet floor polished like a mirror, and a huge picture window that took up the entire living room wall, offering a panoramic view of the city. It was a blank canvas, the perfect place to start from scratch, or at least that's what I told myself. My office job was monotonous and unimportant, so my home had become my only project. I wanted order, cleanliness, clear surfaces. I wanted a life as neat and tidy as that apartment. Without knowing it, I had chosen a trap tailored to me, a perfect stage for the madness that was about to come. The first few weeks were a bomb. I dedicated myself to unpacking the few boxes I had brought, to assembling the simple furniture I had bought. The loneliness was strange, but I preferred it to the noise of reproaches and arguments. I got used to the new routine, to the impersonal sounds of the building, to the distant murmur of traffic that rose from the street like the breaking of distant waves. I felt in control, the architect of a new, simplified existence. I spent hours just enjoying the light, how it moved through the apartment throughout the day, reflecting on the shiny floor and the glass coffee table. Every polished surface was an affirmation of my new life, clean and uncomplicated. The first incident was so subtle, so insignificant, that my mind dismissed it almost instantly. It happened one night, while I was washing the dinner dishes. The kitchen was an open-plan design connected to the living room. As I looked up, my gaze fell on my own reflection in the dark glass of the picture window, which at night became a giant black mirror. I saw myself standing in the kitchen, and behind me the reflected living room. Everything was in order except for one detail. The door of a built-in closet on the back wall, which I perfectly remembered closing that same afternoon when putting away some blankets, was ajar in the reflection, showing a thin line of darkness inside. I dried my hands, annoyed at my own carelessness, and turned to close it. But the actual closet door was completely closed. My heart gave a little leap. I stood still for a moment, looking at the door, feeling its smooth, closed surface. Then I looked back at the reflection in the window. In the reflection, the door was also closed. I blinked, confused. I must have imagined it. A momentary optical illusion. The stress, the lack of sleep, the way the city lights reflected on the glass. It was easy for the mind to play tricks on you. I went back to washing the dishes and forced myself not to think about it anymore. A few days later, I was sitting on the sofa watching a movie. When it ended, I turned off the television. The screen went black, a dark, shiny rectangle. On its surface, the living room was reflected, dimly lit by a floor lamp, and in the reflection on the sofa, I saw a silhouette sitting next to me. It wasn't a clear shape, just a dark blob in the form of a person, motionless. My heart lurched so violently that I was left breathless. I jumped up and turned on the main ceiling light with trembling hands. The sofa was empty. I looked at the television screen again. Now, with the room fully lit, it only reflected the light from the lamp. Panic began to bubble in my chest. I told myself it was just a shadow, a play of light and reflections on the curved surface of the screen. But the feeling that someone had been sitting next to me, the feeling of a cold, silent presence, was terrifyingly real. After that, I started covering the television with a blanket whenever I wasn't using it. From that night on, I started to obsess. The apartment, which I had chosen for its brightness and clean surfaces, became a gallery of mirrors that tested me. Every polished surface was a window to a slightly incorrect version of my reality. I began to notice it everywhere, and my logical mind fought desperately to find explanations. In the reflection of the microwave, the fridge magnet with the shopping list was a centimeter further to the left. In the glass of a picture hanging in the hallway, the reflection of the rug had a subtly different pattern, with the lines slightly misaligned. One day, while pouring myself a glass of water, I stumbled and spilled a little on the black marble countertop. It was a small, irregularly shaped puddle. But when I looked at its reflection in the shiny metal door of the refrigerator, I saw with horror that the reflected stain was not water. It was a dark red, almost black color, and it seemed much larger, spreading slowly. I looked away in horror, and when I looked back, the reflection was once again that of a simple puddle of water. They were minuscule, absurd details. If I told anyone, they would think I had gone crazy. And I myself began to seriously think so. Doubt was a poison that spread slowly through my veins. I spent hours conducting small, pathetic tests to try to maintain my sanity. I would place a book on the glass coffee table, with the corner sticking out exactly 1 centimeter from the edge. Then I would step back and look at the book's reflection in the picture window, taking pictures with my phone to compare them. Most of the time, it was exact. But every now and then, the reflection was wrong. The book would appear flush with the table, or slightly turned. It was like living with a glitch in reality, a synchronization error that only I could perceive. The feeling of being watched was constant, but it didn't come from any dark corner. It came from everywhere, from every shiny surface. It came from my own reflection. I stopped looking at reflective surfaces. I kept the television on even if I wasn't watching it. I drew the curtains as soon as night fell so I wouldn't have to face the large black mirror of the picture window. I started eating on paper plates to avoid seeing my distorted face in the ceramic. I was becoming a prisoner in my own home, fleeing from a ghost that lived on the other side of the glass. My life, which was supposed to be an orderly new beginning, had turned into a chaos of rituals and evasions. The culmination of the first phase of my terror arrived a week later. I had had a horrible day, nervous and startled by every flash of light. Work was piling up because I was unable to concentrate. I felt on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I needed to anchor myself to reality, to convince myself it was just my stress. I went to the bathroom, the only windowless room in the house, my last refuge. I leaned on the sink, turned on the tap, and let the cold water run. I splashed my face again and again, trying to erase the images from my head. Finally, I turned off the tap and looked up at the mirror. My face returned a tired, pale gaze with dark circles under my eyes. "It's just your imagination," I said to myself in a low voice, my breath fogging the glass. "You're exhausted, that's all." I needed to believe it with all my might. I forced myself to keep my gaze fixed on my own eyes, searching for the man I was just a few weeks ago, the one who had plans, the one who believed in blank canvases. The reflection was perfect. It imitated my every blink, every small movement of my head, the way my shoulders rose and fell with my agitated breath. The tension in my body began to relax. It was me. Despite everything, it was still me. It was only me. And just in that moment of relief, in that letting down of my guard, it happened. While I remained completely motionless, watching, the face of my reflection changed. The expression of fear and exhaustion vanished, replaced by one of cold calm, of almost clinical curiosity. And then, my reflection's right hand rose slowly. It was not a sudden or ghostly movement. It moved with a quiet fluidity, with a weight and intention that were absolutely real, without any hurry, until the tip of its index finger rested on its lips, in a universal, unmistakable gesture, ordering me to be silent. My own hands were still resting heavily on the edge of the sink, cold and immobile as stones. The terror was so absolute, so pure that I couldn't scream. I was left without air, without a pulse, trapped in the gaze of my other self, the one who lived on the other side of the mirror and who had just shown me that he was aware, and that he had his own intentions. I stumbled out of the bathroom, a choked scream in my throat. I didn't look back. I ran to the living room and curled up in the corner farthest from any shiny surface, my eyes closed, trembling. The image of my own face, inhabited by something else, and the gesture of silence from my own reflection, repeated in my mind like a broken record. There was no longer room for doubt or logical explanations. I wasn't losing my mind. My apartment was occupied by an entity that lived on the other side of the glass, and that entity was conscious. It knew that I knew. The game was over, and the real terror was about to begin. I spent the night awake, sitting on the living room floor, my back against the wall, as far as possible from any surface that could betray me. Every creak of the building was torture. Was it him, moving on the other side, testing the barrier? The image of his finger on his lips was not a request for silence, it was a threat. I know your secret, I know your fear. I thought about running away, grabbing my keys and running down the stairs, but a terrifying idea stopped me in my tracks. What if I went out into the street and saw him in a shop window, or in the rearview mirror of a car? What if he wasn't tied to the apartment, but to me? That question anchored me to the floor, a prisoner between the need to flee and the terror of what I might find outside. As soon as dawn broke, and the sunlight replaced the dark reflections of the night, I began my work. My first action was a war against my own home. I started with the bathroom mirror, the epicenter of my terror. I didn't dare look at it. I covered it with a towel blindly, feeling the cold of the glass through the fabric. Then, the television. I covered it with a heavy blanket, smothering its black, shiny eye. I went through the apartment like a crazed censor, taping newspapers over the microwave door, the oven, even the polished metal range hood. Every surface that could return an image of me, no matter how small or distorted, was an enemy. The most difficult task was the huge picture window in the living room. I didn't have curtains big enough, so I dragged the mattress from my bedroom and propped it against the glass, blocking most of the view and plunging the apartment into a constant gloom. I worked for hours, sweating, without stopping, until every reflective surface in the house was covered. When I finished, I sat in the middle of the living room, panting, in my now opaque fortress. I felt ridiculous, but for the first time in days I felt a hint of safety. The safety lasted less than an hour. I was in the kitchen, making a sandwich, when I heard a sharp noise coming from the living room, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. I froze. With the bread knife still in my hand, I peeked out cautiously. The living room was in shadow, just as I had left it. Nothing was broken. The glass coffee table was intact. The pictures on the wall, too. The sound had been incredibly clear, but there was no cause. My heart was pounding. I went back to the kitchen, confused and scared. As I put the knife down, my gaze fell on the surface of a metal spoon in the dish rack. For an instant, in the tiny curved reflection, I saw the image of the living room. And in that reflection, the glass coffee table was shattered, with thousands of fragments scattered on the carpet. I blinked, and the reflection returned to being a simple distortion of light. The entity no longer needed a mirror. It could show me its world and its actions in it, through anything. And it was showing me that it could break things, that it could be violent. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to understand what was happening. Before looking for news, my logical mind, in its last act of rebellion, sought an escape in psychiatry. I searched online for delusions, hallucinations, Capgras syndrome, where one believes their loved ones have been replaced by imposters. Could it be that? Could my own mind be projecting an imposter, other me, in the reflections? The idea offered me a brief, false comfort, but it didn't explain anything. It didn't explain the reflected closet that was open, nor the puddle of water that reflected as blood. My brain couldn't alter the physics of light. No, this wasn't coming from inside me. It was an invasion. The next day, mustering my courage, I went down to talk to the building's doorman. The doorman, an elderly man of few words, was reluctant at first. "I don't know anything," he said, while sweeping the entrance. I insisted, slipping a bill into his hand. His eyes glanced at it and he sighed. "He was a weird guy," he said in a low voice. "Quiet at first, but then he got strange. He would shout at night. The neighbors complained. Sometimes when I went up to collect the trash, I'd hear him talking to himself. Well, no, shouting. He was shouting at the walls." He paused, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. One day, the police had to break down the door. They found him in the living room. He had smashed every mirror, every piece of glass with a hammer. He was curled up in a corner, trembling. He kept saying that the man in the mirror wanted to get out, that he wanted to steal his face. Poor devil. His words hit me like a punch. The man in the mirror wants to get out. I wasn't crazy. Or at least, I wasn't the first to go crazy in this apartment. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom, the place that seemed safest, and searched online. Local news archives, police reports. It took me a while, but I found a small press clipping from a year ago. It talked about a man evacuated from his apartment in my building. The report quoted neighbors who heard screaming and the sound of breaking glass. The police found him in a catatonic state, curled up in his living room, surrounded by the fragments of a large mirror he had shattered. The only sentence he repeated over and over was, "He almost made it." I understood everything. It wasn't a ghost. It was a trap. The apartment, or something in it, was a connection point to that other place, the world of the reflection. And the creature that inhabited it wanted to cross over. It wanted to switch places. The previous tenant was almost replaced, and he saved himself at the last moment by breaking the mirror. Now it was my turn. The storm began that very night, as if the sky knew the final act had arrived. The wind howled and the rain beat against the mattress propped against the window, and then the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was total. The building's generator didn't start. A general blackout. My apartment, my blind fortress, was plunged into absolute blackness. And in that blackness, the storm outside became my only terrible projector. A flash of lightning lit up the sky. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arm stand on end. It smelled of ozone, like the air just before lightning strikes. I was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by an invisible force that kept me anchored to the floor. My feet felt like lead. My lungs refused to take in air. I could only watch, a helpless spectator to my own replacement. The storm outside was an echo of the storm raging in that room, a silent battle for reality itself. For a second, the living room window, despite the mattress, became a gigantic mirror. In the brief flash, I saw myself reflected, standing in the middle of the living room. A second of darkness. Another flash of lightning. I looked again. My reflection was still there, but the reflected living room behind it was different. The furniture was twisted, as if it were melting. The next flash was the worst. My reflection was no longer imitating me. It was smiling, a wide, predatory smile, and it began to walk towards the glass, towards me. A new flash closer. My double's face was now pressed against the inside of the window, its features distorted by the pressure against the glass. It had no eyes, only dark sockets, but I knew it was looking at me. Its mouth moved, forming my name in silence, a mute mockery. I screamed. In the following darkness, I felt an unnatural cold at my back. The thing was no longer on the other side. The next flash of lightning illuminated the final scene. I looked at the window and saw myself, but it wasn't a reflection. It was me, trapped inside the glass, my face contorted with terror, screaming in silence. And in the real room where I should have been, I felt the presence of my double, now almost corporeal, turning around to enjoy his new home. The exchange was almost complete. I had no time left. I don't know where I found the strength. As my double solidified and I felt my own essence fading, being absorbed by the glass, I did the only thing I could do. I grabbed the heavy floor lamp beside me. With a scream that was half rage and half terror, I lifted it and threw it with all my might against the picture window. The sound of the glass shattering was deafening, like a scream from the building itself. A gale of wind and rain burst into the apartment, and with it, a sound I will never forget. A high-pitched, inhuman howl that seemed to be dragged outside, into the storm, dissolving into nothingness. The presence in the room vanished. I fell to my knees, gasping, soaked by the rain, surrounded by thousands of glass fragments. I was alone. I moved out the next day. I didn't pack anything. I just left. I now live in an old house, full of wood, rough walls, and matte surfaces. There is nothing in it that can give me a clear image of myself. And yet, sometimes the fear returns. When I pass a shop window, when I look at the dark screen of my phone, I feel a chill, the need to check if the man looking back at me moves at the exact same time as I do. I went to that apartment looking for a blank canvas to become a new version of myself. I didn't know that another, darker version was already there, waiting for the opportunity to do the exact same thing. I have learned that sometimes the greatest danger is not what haunts us, but the version of ourselves that could replace us, the one that lives just on the other side of the reflection, waiting for us to blink. My job is to put a price on ghosts. Not real ones, of course. I'm an antiques valuer. When a wealthy, solitary person dies, their heirs call me to enter their silent homes and assess the objects they have left behind. I convert the memories of others into neat figures on a report. I am a skeptic by nature and by profession. I don't believe in auras or presences, only in the patina of time and the demands of the market. The Valdemar family commission was, however, the strangest of my career. I drove to the property along a country lane that wound deep into an oak forest. The woodland manor appeared at the end of the track, a decrepit mansion of grayish stone, covered in ivy, which looked more like a ruin than a home. The gardens were a jungle of weeds and statues of angels whose faces had been eaten away by moss. The family's solicitor, a nervous man in an oversized suit, handed me a single iron key. He explained that the West Wing, which contained his great-grandfather's study and personal library, had been sealed for 52 years. Ever since Senor Valdemar, a scholar with eccentric tastes, vanished without a trace one winter's night. No one had entered since. The door had been locked and the access corridor bricked up. The family just wants to be done with it, he told me, avoiding looking directly at the West Wing. Do your job, put a price on everything, and we'll get rid of it. But a word of advice. Don't be too impressed by the place. It plays tricks on the mind. I nodded with a professional smile, thinking it was just the typical superstition of heirs faced with an old, gloomy place. Opening the door was like unsealing a tomb. The air that billowed out was dense, still, and heavy with the smell of old paper, dried leather, and dust. The dust of half a century of oblivion. The interior was plunged into a perpetual gloom as the shutters on the tall windows were closed. Using the beam of a powerful torch, I moved down a short corridor that opened into the library. It was an enormous two-story room with walls covered in floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. In the center, a heavy oak desk looked like the altar of a forgotten temple. Everything was coated in a fine layer of gray dust, a uniform shroud that enveloped it all. The first few days were passed in monastic silence, broken only by my own movements. The work was methodical and absorbing. Book by book, object by object, I photographed, measured, noted its condition, and looked up references on my laptop. Valdemar's collection was fascinating and bizarre. Alongside valuable first editions of classics, I found untitled leather-bound tomes filled with star charts that didn't correspond to any known constellation, and architectural treatises describing buildings with impossible geometries, staircases that ascended and descended at the same time. On the tables were strange brass and glass objects, polyhedrons with dozens of faces that seemed to defy spatial logic. Everything spoke of a mind obsessed with the arcane, with patterns and the limits of reality. The first phenomenon occurred on the third day. I was working at the desk when I heard a clear, distinct sound coming from upstairs, from the library's upper gallery. It was footsteps, slow, measured, the unmistakable creak of shoes on wood. I froze, listening. The solicitor had assured me the upper floor was empty, full of sealed rooms. The footsteps crossed the gallery from one end to the other and then stopped. I held my breath. My logical mind immediately kicked in. The house was old. The wood contracted with temperature changes. Structural noises were normal. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Even so, I worked that afternoon with the uncomfortable feeling that someone else was in the building. The next day, the anomalies were harder to rationalize. I had spent the entire morning cataloging a collection of antique globes. Before leaving for lunch, I placed the last one, a particularly ornate piece, on the pile of inventoried items to the left of the desk. When I returned an hour later, the globe was in the exact center of the table, as if it were waiting for me. I was alone in the wing. The only access door was locked from the inside. Later, I couldn't find my reading glasses. I searched for them everywhere, frustrated. I finally found them on the highest shelf of a nearby bookcase, almost 3 meters up, a place where it was physically impossible for me to have left them. Added to these events were the cold spots. Suddenly, an area of the room would turn icy, a biting cold that had nothing to do with drafts. I took out the laser thermometer I used to measure the temperature of delicate objects. The ambient temperature was 18 degrees, but in that invisible spot, the thermometer read 3. I pointed it elsewhere and it went back to 18. I aimed it at the spot again and it read 3 once more. It was a measurable, real phenomenon, but with no logical cause. But the true phenomenon, the one that made my skepticism falter, manifested that very afternoon. The sunlight was filtering through the cracks in the shutters, creating long stripes of light and dust in the air. I looked up from my work to rest my eyes and glance towards the large window at the far end of the library. And I saw him. Standing in front of the window was a man. He was a translucent figure, like an image made of smoke. But the form was clear, a tall man in period clothing, looking out at the garden. He was completely motionless. It lasted barely 3 seconds. I blinked, and the figure had vanished. My heart was pounding. I stood up and walked to the window, but there was nothing there. It was a trick of the light. I spent the next half an hour trying to recreate the effect, moving my torch, opening and closing the shutters. It was futile, and I felt ridiculous, a man of science trying to disprove his own eyes. Frustration grew in me, the feeling that the rules of logic did not apply in that place. I saw him again the next day, and the day after. Always in the same place at the same time of the afternoon. Always the same posture. I began to treat it like another item in the inventory, trying to impose my logic over the fear. I would note the exact time of its appearance and disappearance in my notebook. Recurring optical phenomenon, I wrote, trying to maintain a professional distance. I measured the duration, the intensity of the light, any variable. This obsession with documenting it distracted me from my real work. I found I was spending more time staring at the empty window, waiting for the echo, than cataloging the books in front of me. The apparition, passive as it was dictating the rhythm of my days, a thought I found deeply unsettling. My skepticism didn't vanish, but it mingled with a morbid fascination. It was during the second week that the echo began to change. At first it was the sound. While I watched the translucent figure, I began to hear an incredibly faint noise, the rhythmic scratching of a quill on paper, even though the figure was standing with its hands behind its back. The echo was gaining complexity, adding layers of sound to the image. The feeling of unease returned with greater force. A recording doesn't change. A recording doesn't evolve. One afternoon I watched the apparition for longer than usual, with that same scientific curiosity. The figure was there, as always, looking out the window. But this time it seemed different, less transparent, more defined. The air around it felt colder, and I noticed that the thousands of dust motes floating in the light beams seemed to divert around its silhouette, as if it had a physical presence. In addition to the scratching of the quill, I perceived a very faint smell of ink and pipe tobacco. It was adding more and more sensory details to the scene. I noticed it wasn't motionless. Its head was slightly tilted, as if it were listening to something. I strained my own ears, but I could only hear the dusty silence of the library. The figure sighed. I heard the sound clearly, a long sigh laden with an infinite sadness that gave me goosebumps. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the apparition. This was new. This was impossible. An echo does not sigh. An echo does not feel. And then the thing happened that shattered all my defenses and plunged me into pure terror. With an agonizing, unnatural slowness, the translucent figure's head began to turn. It didn't move like an image, but like a real person, with weight and will. It turned, centimeter by centimeter, until its face was in profile, and then it kept turning until it was looking at me. Its face was pale, its features distorted by an anguish that seemed eternal, and its eyes, two pools of translucent despair, locked directly onto mine. The echo, the passive recording, the optical phenomenon, was looking at me, and in its gaze, I saw a warning and a desperate plea. The ghost of Senor Valdemar knew I was there. The pen fell from my hand, making a disproportionately loud clatter in the library's silence. I tried to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat, a knot of pure ice. I stumbled back, knocking my chair over with a crash. I couldn't look away. Those eyes didn't just see me. They pierced through me, pinning me to the spot with the weight of 50 years of solitude and a terrible warning that needed no words to be understood. The world shrank to the ghost's anguished face. Time stopped. We remained like that, the appraiser of flesh and blood and the conscious echo, staring at each other across an abyss of 50 years. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, but its warning gaze was seared into my mind. I fell backwards, the impact of my body on the wooden floor breaking the spell. Pure terror gave way to a surge of adrenaline. I gathered my things with trembling hands, with no clear plan beyond getting out of there, back to the world where shadows obey the laws of physics, and the dead do not look back at you. I reached the main door of the wing and took out the heavy iron key, but I couldn't turn it. I stopped. The plea in Valdemar's eyes had not been a threat. It had been a cry for help. If I left now, I would be abandoning him to his fate, to repeat his silent loop until the building turned to dust. The valuer in me wanted to flee and forget. But curiosity, that dangerous driving force of humanity, whispered for me to stay. I returned to the library, my heart still racing, but with a new and terrible determination. I was no longer there to appraise objects. I was there to decipher a mystery. I didn't have to wait long. The next day, communication became more direct. I was standing in the middle of the room, not knowing where to begin, when I heard a sharp thud. A book had fallen from one of the shelves on the upper floor. I climbed the stairs cautiously. The book was lying open on the floor. It was a treatise on Renaissance architecture. I picked it up. There was nothing special about it except for a small pencil annotation in the margin of a page describing the Pantheon in Rome. The note read, "The dome is not a perfect hemisphere. There is a deliberate error, a deviation of 0.2 degrees. Why?" I paid it no mind and returned to my work. An hour later, a blast of icy air hit my face, even though all the windows were sealed. The current seemed to originate from another bookshelf, this time on the ground floor. I approached it. The cold was intense in front of a section of astronomy books. I ran my fingers along the spines until the cold was concentrated on one of them. I pulled it out. It was an 18th century star atlas. Again, a note in the margin next to the constellation of Orion. "The 3 stars of the belt are not aligned. The third deviates. The pattern is broken." Over the following days, the ghost of Senor Valdemar guided me through his library. A falling object, a cold spot, the faint whisper of a word like "look" or "here." Each clue led me to a different book. Mathematics, acoustics, optics, and in every book I found the same obsession. Valdemar was not interested in accepted knowledge, but in its flaws, in the small deviations from perfection, in the cracks in reality. He filled dozens of notebooks with his own notes, comparing the deviation of a dome with that of a constellation, searching for a universal pattern in error. The final clue led me to the large oak desk. The spirit manifested there, not as a full apparition, but as a translucent hand that pointed to a specific spot beneath the desktop. I searched and found a small button hidden in the wooden filigree. When I pressed it, a side panel of the desk clicked open, revealing a secret compartment. Inside was a single object, a black leather-bound diary, Senor Valdemar's personal journal. I sat down and began to read. The handwriting, at first elegant and controlled, became more frantic as the pages turned. The diary confirmed my suspicions. Valdemar believed that the universe was not perfect. He believed that the small errors in geometry, light, and sound were the seams of reality, and that if one found the correct pattern of those errors, one could learn to unpick them. He called his theory the geometry of the echo. For years he used his library as a laboratory, searching for the formula. And finally, he found it. The last part of the diary was terrifying. Valdemar described how he had discovered a ritual, a geometric pattern that, if drawn on the floor of a room and activated with a specific series of sound frequencies, could open a door. Not a physical door, but a dimensional one. An entrance to what he called the impossible room, a place outside of space and time. His intention was to look through that door, to gain knowledge. The last entry was dated the night he disappeared. He wrote with a feverish urgency that he had drawn the pattern on the study floor and begun the ritual. "The door is opening," he wrote. "I can see it. It is not a room. It is a universe of wrong angles and dead light. It is beautiful and horrific. I thought it would be empty, but there is something inside. It has seen me. It is crossing over. It is not an echo. It doesn't repeat. It just bends. It bends everything. Light, sound, space. I have made a terrible mistake." At that moment, the air in the library changed. The oppressive atmosphere I had felt upon arriving intensified 1,000 times over. The dust in the air stopped floating and fell to the floor at once. A deep, unnatural silence descended upon the room. I understood the truth. Valdemar's ghost was not the only presence in the wing. He was just the warden, the alarm, the thing that had crossed over, the entity from the impossible room, was still here. And by reading the diary, I had let it know that I knew it was there. I looked around. At first I saw nothing different. But then, my valuer's eyes, trained to see details, noticed something. The corner of the room to my right seemed farther away than it should be. The bookshelf next to it appeared slightly curved, as if seen through a lens. The frame of the door I had entered through was no longer a perfect rectangle. One of the angles was slightly more acute than 90 degrees. The room's geometry was beginning to fail. A dreadful creak echoed behind me. I turned to see one of the heavy oak bookshelves bending in the middle, books cascading down, not towards the floor, but sideways, as if gravity had shifted in that area. Panic flooded me. I ran for the main door, but the access corridor had lengthened, stretching towards an impossibly distant vanishing point. I was trapped. The library was no longer a room. It was a conscious and deadly trap. The diary was still open on the desk. Valdemar's ghost appeared beside it, this time solid, desperate, and pointed to one of the last sentences his living self had written. The pattern must be closed. The echo must be completed. I remembered the diagrams of the ritual in the preceding pages. There was a closing pattern, a counter-ritual. It was my only hope. As the room warped around me, the walls rippling like fabric and the floor tilting beneath my feet, I frantically searched for the objects Valdemar had described. A set of crystal polyhedrons that were on the mantelpiece. The diary said they had to be placed on the key points of the pattern he had drawn on the floor, now hidden under a dusty rug. I dragged the rug aside while books flew around me like enraged birds. The pattern was there, a complex diagram of circles and angles chalked onto the wood. The entity howled, a sound like screeching metal and shattering glass combined. The light from the windows bent, casting impossible shapes on the floor. I placed the polyhedrons in their spots, following the diagram, with Valdemar's ghost pointing, helping me. The final step was sound. Valdemar had written that the pattern had to be sealed with a specific frequency. I didn't have his equipment, but in a final note, there was an alternative. The human voice, if it holds the correct note, can resonate with the structure and close the wound. He had noted the pitch, an incredibly low, sustained note. I took a deep breath in the midst of the chaos, closed my eyes, and made the sound, a deep drone that vibrated in my chest. The instant I did, everything stopped. The wind ceased. The books fell to the floor. The walls stopped rippling. The room returned to its normal geometry. When I opened my eyes, the library was silent. A real, empty silence. Valdemar's ghost was standing by the desk. He looked at me, and for the first time there was no anguish on his face. only immense gratitude. He nodded once, slowly, and then faded away, this time for good. I left that same night. I left the diary on the desk, as a warning for whoever came next if anyone ever dared. My report for the Valdemar family was brief. I declared that the contents of the library were of no value, that the best thing to do was to brick up the wing again and never open it. Sometimes in my work, as I observe the perfect symmetry of a vase or the precise lines of a piece of furniture, I feel a shiver. Valdemar taught me that reality is fragile, that it rests on a geometry we take for granted, but that there are errors, echoes of impossible patterns, and in those cracks dwell things that do not understand right angles or parallel lines. I went to that house to put a price on the past, and I was almost trapped in it. I learned that some knowledge comes at too high a cost and that some mysteries are best left sealed, kept in the silence of forgotten rooms. My trade was measuring the world with tapes, ropes, and levels, putting numbers on surfaces that didn't want numbers, drawing lines on maps that always seemed cleaner than the real places. It gave me a living and also an alibi. If I was measuring, I didn't have to feel. That year, I was commissioned to survey the perimeter of the Old Valley Reservoir, as the drought had cut its size by half, and the local council wanted to update the boundaries, paths, and access points. The reservoir had swallowed an entire village when it was built, and the locals still spoke the names of its underwater streets like someone remembering a relative whose photograph has been lost. I took the job out of habit, routine, out of that stubborn impulse to keep doing what I know how to do, even when I have no desire to. I drove the white van, loaded with stakes, a hammer, binoculars, an old drone, and a notebook where I jot down things I later forget. I arrived at the water's edge in the early hours, when the light was still slanted and didn't hurt to look at. The water had retreated, leaving behind a ring of cracked mud, gray slabs with fissures that looked like maps within the map. Further down, short walls, corners, and the skeleton of a fountain poked through. The air smelled of rotten wood and algae that had never seen the sea. There were silent birds, telephone poles that no longer connected anything, and a bell tower with no bell, pointing to a sky with no answer. I set up the tripod base and marked the first point. The mud sucked at my boots with an animal patience. Every step was a short truce. I noted down figures, angles, distances, and each figure said less than the silence of the place. The old men at the roadside bar had told me not to go down when the sun was directly overhead, and to avoid being at the bottom at dusk, because the valley has a memory and reclaims what was taken from it. They laughed as they said it, but there was a strange glint in their eyes, a glint I recognized. I'd seen it in clients who couldn't sell a house because the walls remembered screams. At the reservoir, the world was still, and yet something vibrated beneath it. A murmur I felt in my knees, not my ears. I paid it no mind. I kept measuring. Mid-morning, I launched the drone to trace a flight grid over the lower area. The device rose unhurriedly, taking the only living hum in the place with it. On the screen appeared the mosaics of mud, the ruins, and ownerless shadows. I stopped when I saw a patch that didn't fit with anything else. At first glance, it was a darker area north of the bell tower, an oval shape where the mud didn't crack. I planned to approach on foot. I put the drone away, took my stakes, and followed a line of cracks that looked like a path. Each crack marked a small dip, each dip a crunch, and each crunch reminded me that this had been the bottom of the water for decades. When I reached it, I saw that the patch was a smooth floor that didn't belong to the mud. A surface of faded tiles with barely visible geometric patterns. It was a room without walls. The floor of a house that had withstood the weight of the water and now emerged like a tongue. In its center, covered in dry silt, was a stone circle. I first thought it was a wellhead. Wiping it with my boot, I uncovered an iron lid with a rusted ring. A well. A chill crept under my shirt, though the day was scorching. I had no reason to open it. It wasn't part of the job. But the trade of measuring brings with it a kind of quiet arrogance. You think that if you can put a number to something, that something loses its power to hurt you. I used the hammer as a lever to lift the lid. The iron resisted like a scab, and then gave way with a flat groan. Below I saw no water. I saw nothing. A perfectly black hole. It smelled of a damp chest and of absence. There was no draft of air. I sat on the edge with a false sense of caution and dropped a pebble in. I counted the seconds. I didn't hear it land. The sound never came back up. There was a timeless instant, and then I heard something I can't describe without it sounding ridiculous. I heard what you'd hear if the world took a breath but decided to hold it. I moved away and closed the lid. I noted the position and the word well in my notebook and carried on with my points. I tried to, at least, because every time I looked up the circle was there, more present than the figures. At midday I went up to the shore to eat something. The bread tasted of plaster. I thought about calling the office and saying that part wasn't safe, that it needed fencing off. I didn't call. I didn't want to explain why. In the early afternoon, I returned to the bottom. The shadows had shortened and the air vibrated with a dirty heat. The bell tower seemed lower. I don't know if it was, or if I was just deeper inside my own head. I marked a final point near the tiled room, planted the stake, and when I looked up, I saw footprints that weren't mine. They were slender, barefoot prints that led out from the smooth oval and into the mud circling the well. They weren't deep. They were recent. I looked all around. There was no one. The parched surface held no trace of a body that could have made them. There were only the footprints and the heat. I convinced myself they could be bird tracks or a trick of the cracked mud. I went back to work. The hammer struck wood, and each blow sounded hollow, as if there was a box under the mud. When I packed up, the sun was already dipping towards the mountain, and the valley began to change color. The yellow of the dust faded, and a gray that wasn't a normal shadow ignited. It was a gray with weight. I decided to leave. I was walking towards the van when my phone vibrated with a low battery warning. I put it away without looking. As I passed the room, the well lid was ajar again, leaving a black slit. I could have sworn I'd set it down properly. I pushed it with my foot, and it didn't move. I didn't want to kneel down again. I kept going. On the shore, the air smelled different. I couldn't say if it was better or worse. I realized the silence was cleaner up there. The bottom made a soundless noise that you only notice when you can breathe normally again. I drove to the village and slept in a cheap guest house, with the fan stirring a heat that wouldn't leave. I dreamed of underwater houses without water, of tables that still held the marks of plates and hands in a void that was neither wet nor dry. I woke up with a rough throat and an absurd desire to return as soon as possible. The next morning I went back to the reservoir. The light was white, without edges. I went down with a forced determination. I didn't go to the well first, though everything in me was pulling me there. I made 2 lines of points far from the oval, as if by doing so I could infect the place with normality. When I finally allowed myself to approach, I saw that objects had appeared around the stone circle that hadn't been there before. A murky glass tumbler, a wooden spinning top, a piece of floral ribbon, a large jacket button. They were small, domestic objects, dried out, covered in a thin crust of silt. They were arranged in an arc, as if someone had placed them there with care. I stopped a meter away and felt that that meter had too much reason on its side. I didn't want to take the step, yet I did. I touched the spinning top. It was light, and my touch left a clean mark, as if it had just been pulled from the water. I withdrew my hand. In my notebook, I wrote the words "things out of place" and "laughter that makes no sound." I don't remember thinking that sentence. The smell of a damp chest was stronger. I lifted the lid and forced myself to look. I saw a soft gloom, not the blackness of the day before. It was an interior that didn't belong in a well. It was the entrance hall of a house with a floor just like the one beneath my feet, but cleaner, with a white wall that didn't lead anywhere, and a low chair placed beside it, as if waiting for someone who no longer existed. I closed it without a sound. I backed away 2 steps. The sun was like needles on my skin. 1,000 explanations went through my head, and none of them worked. I'm not a believer in anything. I have no family stories that speak of curses, but there are places where things don't need you to believe. They function all the same. I decided I would finish the survey that day and not return. I worked quickly and poorly. My hands trembled, and the numbers came out crooked. I dropped 2 stakes and didn't go back for them. Every half hour, I would look at the oval, and new things would appear. A chipped cup, a small shoe, a photo stuck to the mud showing only the corner of a window. Everything had the texture of something that had lived under pressure for a long time. Late in the day, as the sun began to surrender, I heard a clear sound for the first time. It didn't come from the well. It came from the entire reservoir bed. It was the toll of a bell that didn't exist. It wasn't high or solemn. It was a low note that invited nothing, a warning note with no recipient. I followed the sound without moving. It was the same everywhere. I packed up my things quickly. I wiped the mud off with a stone and climbed the slope, my legs stiff. I didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. Lying in bed, I felt that the valley had stuck to me on the inside, and that breathing was like moving mud. I thought about quitting the job and going somewhere else, but you carry the world in your head, and no amount of distance can fix that. At dawn, I decided I would make one last visit. I had to close the report with a final overview photograph. I didn't want to have to come back later. I took the high road to get a different view. From above, the bottom looked like a deep plate with an oval stain in the center. I went down slowly. In the room, there were no longer any objects. Just the lid of the well wide open. There was no breeze, and yet the lid was vibrating just enough to sound like a tooth on glass. I knelt down one last time. I looked, and I saw myself. Not my face. I saw my back, walking down a dim corridor, holding a lamp that I wasn't holding in my real hand. I recognized myself by the way I walked, by the curve of my shoulders I knew from old photographs. I looked up from the well and had the clear sense that the corridor continued under the valley floor in directions I couldn't measure. These weren't sewers. They were the roots of village plots when it knows it's going to be submerged and doesn't want to lose the map of itself. I stood up and began to talk quietly, so as not to hear myself. I said I was going to close the file, that I was leaving. It was useless, because after 3 steps, I stopped. A line of barefoot tracks led from the oval to where I was standing. I hadn't heard any steps. The prints were fresh. The mud was indented with a dampness that didn't match the air. I didn't feel immediate terror. I felt something else. A cruel clarity, like when a doctor says a simple word that changes your life. I understood that the valley was not an empty place that held remains. I understood that the valley was a body, and that the bottom hadn't truly dried out. The drought had only peeled back the visible skin. Beneath it lay the real water. Not the water on maps, but the water that keeps what doesn't float. And that body needed someone to act as a bridge, a keeper of memory. I took a step back. I thought about running. The mud gave way an inch. The world was too much in that inch. I breathed through my nose to avoid swallowing the smell, and that smell now came with single words. It wasn't speech. They were units of meaning that were once sentences. House, child, Monday, bread, courtyard, shirt, thread, stone. I said no quietly, and the no was a small stone that changed nothing. I looked at the dry surface surrounding the oval, and it seemed like old skin. I told myself that the job had saved me on other occasions and that it would save me here. I took out my notebook and wrote an absurd list. Perimeter, deviation, elevation, risk, fence, warning, closure. Writing gave me a wall. Then the bell tower tolled for a second time. The sound crossed my list and erased the words as if they were chalk. I put the notebook away. I didn't want anything of mine to be left there. I walked away without running, because to run would have been to accept that I could lose. I got to the van. I started to pack up. The engine was already running when I felt I had to look one more time, just to be sure I was finally leaving. I looked. The oval seemed darker. A flock of birds circled without landing. Then it left. The valley fell still. I drove. Halfway up the hill, the engine coughed and died. There was no reason. The gauge showed half a tank. I tried to start it. No response. I got out and opened the bonnet as if I knew what to look for. It didn't smell of petrol. It didn't smell of anything. I sat on the verge with the sun beating down on my neck. I thought I could walk down to the village and get help. I glanced down and saw my boots were stained with a thin film of green silt, the same I had seen in the well. I hadn't been close enough to get stained like that. I understood that I had already been getting closer, without moving. I turned off the ignition and tried again. The engine started first time, as if in mockery. I didn't think twice. I left. I handed in the report with enough figures that no one would ask about the rest. For a week, I forced myself to live on the surface. I ate in noisy bars, talked about football with strangers, watched a match repeat just to have a steady sound in the house. At night, I closed the blinds and left a wide light on in the hall so the flat wouldn't have corners. Even so, every time I closed my eyes, I heard the low note of the bell-less bell, and beneath the note, the held breath of the valley. I didn't go back to the reservoir. The job was closed, I got paid, I thought it would be over, it wasn't. Small things started appearing in places they shouldn't. An old button in the kitchen sink, a piece of floral ribbon next to my toothbrush. On the dining table, a damp wooden spinning top that left a mark on the tablecloth when I touched it. I put the objects in a box and didn't throw them out. I don't know why. I suppose you don't throw away something that feels like it's watching you. One afternoon, I opened the box to count them, and there was one more. A murky glass tumbler with a chipped rim. I washed it and left it upside down. At night, the glass was on the floor, upright, with a single drop of water inside. No tap had been on. I started writing another list, this time without technical terms. I put, sleep well, keep light on, don't go near edges, avoid long silences. The list sustained me for 3 days. The fourth night, I dreamed I was opening a door and the dream didn't want to end. I woke up sweating, my fingers aching from digging my nails into my hand, as if remembering an old gesture that wasn't mine. That day, I got a call from the council to check a new water intake. The drought was continuing and they wanted to verify another shoreline. I said no, but then I said yes. I don't like to leave jobs half-finished. I returned to the valley at dusk, not by choice, but because I had to finish other things. I parked at the top. I walked with my arms tensed like someone carrying a weight even when they're carrying nothing. The bottom was the same, and yet different. There was a bluish clarity that didn't come from the sky. In the center, the oval was a mirror with no reflection. I approached it without wanting to. On the stone, there was a new line someone had etched with a hard object. It said Monday. That day was a Monday. I thought of the word like a rope. If the place writes, it also reads. A desire arose in me that felt like it belonged to someone else. I wished for the valley to use me as a measure to finish its remembering. I took another step and looked down. Inside the well, I saw a courtyard with washing lines but no clothes, A dry stone fountain, a wall with the shadow of a window, a narrow path that disappeared to the right. I didn't go down. I didn't have to. The air changed on my face, the way it does when you open a sealed room, and the small objects I'd kept in the box at home appeared arranged in a semicircle beside me on the tiled floor. I hadn't brought them. I wasn't scared. It's strange to say it like that, but I wasn't scared. I understood that the sustained fear had grown tired, and what was left was something else, a wide sorrow. I sat on the edge and thought about my trade, to measure, to draw, to name. It served to avoid other kinds of measures. I realized the valley didn't want me to believe in anything, only that I shouldn't forget, that someone should record, with a method the valley could use, that there were once streets with names no one says anymore, that there were courtyards where bread was left to dry, that there were Mondays. That didn't justify everything. It didn't erase what had tried to swallow me, but it gave it a frame. I took out my notebook. I started a new list. This time, with names I didn't know I knew. I wrote Mill Street, Ash Tree Square, Station Passage, Carmen's House, Jose's Bakery, Anita's Yard. The names came on their own. Whether they were accurate or not didn't matter. I felt that others were the accurate ones, those rising from below in a current that didn't get you wet. That night there was no bell. There was a murmur of footsteps. Not one person, several. They weren't asking for anything. They weren't in a hurry. I stayed there until the mountain's shadow covered the bottom. Then I left. After that, I returned for several days at the same time, without telling anyone. I made notes, drew sketches, counted rows of cracks like someone counting beads on a rosary. The well showed a different scene each afternoon. I never saw people, only what they leave behind. A spread tablecloth with no plates, a cradle with no mattress, a door that opened into an interior that never fully came into being. I never went down. I didn't need to. I was measuring a cursed environment, and the environment was measuring me with the same attention. When I finished my map, the most useless and the truest one I have ever made, I left one folded copy in my desk drawer and another inside the box of objects. It had no human recipient. One Sunday morning, while having coffee, the news announced a storm forecast for the following week. I saw the clear sky and thought of the word next as if it were a place. The first cloud arrived on Wednesday. On Thursday, it rained all day. On Friday, the valley began to fill, and the tiled room became a puddle, then smooth water. I went to say goodbye without telling anyone. I stood on the high bank. I didn't go down. I watched the oval disappear under a gray skin that tightened without a sound. I heard the toll of the bell one more time, louder this time, and it felt like a thank you that didn't come from any language. I didn't interpret it as forgiveness or closure. It was a note in a margin. I left as it began to get dark. The water was rising slowly and quickly at the same time, the way decisions rise. At home that night, I opened the box to count the objects. The spinning top was gone, and I understood that was enough. My fear isn't rational. I know that. A phobia is, by definition, a failure of logic. But knowing that doesn't help when the lights go out. For me, darkness isn't a simple absence of light. It's a presence. It's a weight that settles on your chest. A silence that smothers all other sounds. A cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It's a state in which things change. It all comes from a blurred memory. A splinter lodged in my mind from when I was 5 years old. The smell of damp earth in a cellar. The heavy sound of a wooden door closing and a metallic click. And then, the blackness. A darkness so absolute I felt it was erasing me, dissolving me. I don't remember how long I was in there, but it was long enough to learn that in the dark the shapes of objects become wrong and distances lie. I've spent my entire adult life fighting it. My life has been a defensive strategy, a guerrilla war against the night. That's why this apartment was my final victory. My fortress. A 12th floor open-plan designer penthouse in the city center. I chose it for its floor-to-ceiling windows that swallowed the daylight. But the real masterpiece of engineering was my lighting system. There wasn't a single dark corner. 72 high-power LED bulbs, controlled by a smart home system. I could turn on every light in the house with a voice command. I had motion sensors, and, as if that weren't enough, a backup diesel generator on the balcony and half a dozen battery-powered lamps scattered throughout the rooms. It was, in theory, a place where the darkness couldn't get in. The first few weeks were the most peaceful of my life. I slept without needing to leave a light on in the hallway for the first time in 30 years. I felt invincible. I had built a sanctuary of light and had exiled the monster of my childhood. The first crack in my fortress was almost comical. One of the hallway bulbs, an expensive model designed to last a decade, flickered and died. It had only been 3 days since I moved in. Impossible. I changed it, muttering about the poor quality of modern products. 2 days later, one in the living room burned out, and the next morning, another in the kitchen. I bought a new box of bulbs, convinced I'd received a faulty batch. The first real chill came on a Tuesday night. I was working on my computer when the screen flickered and went dark. All the lights in the apartment died at the same time. A micro blackout. The silence was absolute. My heart stopped. I waited for the roar of the generator, but there was only a failed metallic click. It was barely 2 seconds of total blackness, but in that brief instant, I felt two things with a clarity that chilled me to the bone. The first was a drop in temperature so sharp my skin broke out in goosebumps. The second was an unmistakable feeling, the same one I'd get as a child waking up in the middle of the night. The absolute certainty that I was not alone. Then the lights came back on just as abruptly. I blinked, dazzled. The feeling was gone. The air was back to a normal temperature. I stood up on trembling legs and checked the circuit breaker. Everything was in order. The generator hadn't started because the power had returned too quickly. Logical, rational, but the cold and the feeling of an alien presence wouldn't leave my body. That's when I started noticing the shadows. My apartment was designed to minimize them, but they were unavoidable, and they began to behave strangely. At first, it was small things, details that make you doubt your own eyes. I'd be sitting on the sofa reading, the room bathed in light, and I'd glance at the shadow cast by a coat rack and think I saw an extra hook, a dark protrusion that shouldn't be there. I'd look at the coat rack, then back at the shadow. It was normal. It had to be fatigue, but the incidents became more frequent. One afternoon, as I was walking through the living room, I saw out of the corner of my eye that my own shadow lagged behind, dragging for a fraction of a second longer than I did before snapping back into sync with an almost imperceptible twitch. I stopped dead, my heart in my throat. I moved from side to side, watching my shadow. It moved with me, perfectly normal. It was my mind. It had to be my mind. The clearest event happened in the kitchen. I was making dinner, with the powerful white light of the ceiling spotlights illuminating every corner. I turned to get something from the fridge, and my gaze passed over the knife block on the counter. The wooden block had 5 slots, and all 5 knives were in place. But their shadow, cast sharply on the white tiled wall, only showed 4 knives. The shadow of the chef's knife was missing. I stood frozen, staring at the wrong shadow. The dark gap where the silhouette of the large knife should have been was a disturbing absence. It lasted 3, maybe 4 seconds. I blinked, and the shadow returned to normal, showing all 5 knives. My breath was a ragged whistle. My phobia was finding new ways to manifest now that total darkness was no longer a threat. I began to feel like an intruder in my own home. The light was no longer a comfort. It was a stage, a brightly lit stage where something unnatural was happening. The anxiety grew every day. I checked the shadows obsessively, looking for errors, and I found them. The shadow of a book on the table was larger than it should be. The darkness under the bed seemed deeper, almost solid. The light no longer vanquished the shadows. It only made them more obvious, their strangeness more defined. The storm that unleashed the true horror arrived on a Friday night. The sky turned black at 7 in the evening, and the wind began to howl against the windows. The city issued an alert for a scheduled blackout due to an overloaded grid. I smiled. I was prepared. I let the city's panic flow around me. I was safe in my fortress. At 9 o'clock sharp, the lights of the neighboring buildings went out, one by one. Then the streetlights. My apartment continued to shine, a lighthouse in the middle of an ocean of blackness. And then, my own lights flickered once, twice, and died. The silence was total. I held my breath, waiting. 5 seconds. 10. The generator didn't start. A cold sweat began to trickle down my back. I got up, fumbling in the dark, and went to the balcony. The generator's engine was ice cold, dead. Panic began to bubble in my chest. Calm down. I had the emergency lamps. I went for the nearest one in the living room and pressed the switch. A powerful white light flooded the room. I sighed in relief, but the light wasn't stable. It flickered like a candle flame in a draft, and the beam of light seemed to shrink as if the darkness in the corners of the room were pouncing on it, devouring it. It died with a faint hum, having lasted barely 10 seconds. I ran for the one in the kitchen. Same result. 5 seconds of trembling light and then nothing. The bedroom 1, 3. It was as if something was draining the energy, drinking the light. I was left with only the flashlight on my mobile phone. The battery level was at 80%. I felt like the last survivor on a sinking island. The beam of light trembled in my hand as I pointed it into the corners of the room. Everything seemed normal. The furniture was in its place, motionless. But the shadows they cast were enormous, monstrous, and they danced with every tremor of my hand. And then I saw it. I pointed the light at the coffee table. Its shadow was cast on the floor as expected. But as I watched, I saw the shadow move. It slid across the floor, detaching itself from the table legs like a pool of living ink. I aimed the light at the bookshelf. Its shadow did the same, peeling away from the wall and flowing across the hardwood floor. With a horror that paralyzed me completely, I swept the room with the phone's light. All the shadows were doing the same thing. They were disconnecting from their objects. They were pools of liquid blackness that crept slowly, converging in the farthest corner of the living room. They joined one by one, forming a single patch of darkness, a darkness that did not reflect the light from my phone. It was a hole in the world, a piece of absolute void. The patch began to grow, to rise from the floor. It took shape, a vaguely human silhouette, tall, thin, featureless. It was a statue made from the total absence of light. My phone vibrated in my hand, a notification, 10% battery. The screen light flickered. The shadow figure stood motionless for an instant, and then it raised what looked like an arm in my direction. My phone's battery died, but in that final fraction of a second before the total darkness swallowed me, I saw one last thing. The shadow took a step toward me. The darkness that engulfed me was not normal. It was a physical, heavy blackness that silenced the beat of my heart in my ears and the echo of my own breath. The air grew thick and icy. I didn't scream. The terror was so absolute it stole my breath and my voice. My body reacted on pure survival instinct. I threw myself backward, tripping on a rug and falling hard to the floor. I scrambled desperately away from the corner where I had seen the creature, my hands clawing at the hardwood, not knowing if it was following me, if it was floating just above me. Every second was an agony of anticipation. I expected to feel a cold touch, a presence over me. The end. I reached the opposite wall and curled up into a ball, my face against my knees, and waited. The hours that followed were the most refined torture I have ever known. The creature didn't attack me. It simply played with me. In the total darkness, my hearing became painfully sharp. I could hear the soft scrape of something dragging across the ceiling. Then the sound would stop, and I'd hear a faint creak of wood from the other side of the room. They weren't sounds of a direct threat, but of movement, of positioning. It was letting me know it was there, that it could move at will, that it could get to me whenever it wanted. It was a war of nerves, and I was unarmed. Every minute stretched into an eternity of contained panic, waiting for an attack that never came, which was infinitely worse. The light returned in a flash. It wasn't a flicker, but an explosion of illumination. All the lights in the apartment came on at the same time with blinding intensity. The power was back. I blinked, disoriented, my pupils contracting in pain. When my vision adjusted, I looked frantically toward the corner. There was nothing. The room was exactly as it had always been, immaculate, orderly. There was no trace of the figure, the liquid shadows, or the unnatural cold. Everything was perfectly normal. If it weren't for my heart hammering against my ribs and the residual terror that made me tremble, I might have thought I had imagined it all. But I knew. I knew it had been real. Normality was the mask the creature wore, and that was the most terrifying part. That night marked the end of my former life. I survived, yes, but the creature had won the battle. It had desecrated my fortress and shown me that no amount of light could keep me safe. From then on, I lived in a permanent state of siege. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I would stay awake all night, with every light on, sitting on the sofa, drinking one coffee after another, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, searching for the slightest anomaly. I was exhausted, but fear was a more potent stimulant than any caffeine. The entity changed its tactics. It no longer needed to turn off the lights to torment me. It began to play with my perception of reality in broad daylight. The manifestations became more personal, crueler. One day, I was standing in the hallway when I saw out of the corner of my eye my shadow, cast on the white wall, raise an arm. I hadn't moved. I froze, not daring to look directly at it. I turned my head slowly. The shadow was normal, a motionless silhouette anchored to my feet. But I had seen it. I knew what I had seen. The thing that lived in the darkness could now control my own shadow. Paranoia became my only companion. I put tape on the doors to know if they were opened. I left small objects on the floor to detect movement. But the threat wasn't physical. It was a psychological war. One day, I walked into the kitchen and smelled a nauseating odor of damp earth and mold, the smell from my memory of the cellar. The smell filled the room for a minute, and then vanished as quickly as it had come. It was showing me that it knew my deepest fear. It was stripping away my defenses one by one. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I would either go completely insane or find an answer. The answer came in the most unexpected way. While looking for the fuse box, suspecting the creature had tampered with it, I noticed that one of the floorboards in the entryway closet was slightly loose. Prying it up with a screwdriver, I lifted it. Underneath, in the hollow space, was a small, old, and dusty leather-bound notebook. It was a diary. It belonged to a man who had lived in this very apartment 20 years earlier. The first few pages were mundane, but as I read on, the tone changed. He began to describe a feeling of being watched. Then, unexplained electrical problems. And then, in a script that became increasingly erratic and desperate, he began to write about the shadows. He described exactly what I had seen, shadows that moved on their own, that didn't correspond to their objects. He wrote about a figure made of darkness, The last entry in the diary was written with frantic pressure. It read, "It doesn't want the darkness. It feeds on the fear of it. The more light I use to fight it, the stronger it gets. Light casts shadows. My lights are its food. There is only one way out. I have to pay the debt." There were no more pages. The debt of the light. The phrase resonated in my head. I understood everything. My fortress, my 72 bulbs, my generator. They weren't my defenses. They were my weakness. They were a feast for the creature. Every watt of light I used to keep the darkness at bay created more shadows, more gloom, more food for it. My phobia was its power source, and my desperate fight for the light only made it stronger and stronger. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't run. The thing wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to my fear. If I left, it would follow me. There was only one way out, the same one the man in the diary had come to. I had to face it. I had to do the thing I feared most in the world. I waited until the night was complete. The city glowed through the windows. With my heart in a vice, I walked to the main circuit breaker by the door. I placed my hand on the master switch. It was the most terrifying act of my life, more than any darkness I had ever endured. It was an act of surrender and defiance at the same time. I took a deep breath, and I threw the switch. The darkness was instantaneous, absolute. The silence was total. I stood motionless in the center of the living room, my body shaking uncontrollably. The blackness was so dense I felt blind. The fear from my childhood returned with the force of a hurricane threatening to drown me. I screamed inwardly that I must not be afraid, that this was what it wanted. And then, I felt it. The drop in temperature, the presence filling the room. This time I didn't hide. I stood tall, forcing myself to breathe slowly and deeply. I could feel it moving around me, a current of cold air brushing against my skin. And in my mind I felt a pressure and attempt to force its way in, to find the panic it fed on. I felt its curiosity, its confusion. Where was the terror? I opened my eyes to the darkness, and in the center of the blackness, I saw a blackness even deeper. The figure was there just a few meters from me. I couldn't see it, but I could perceive it, an absence of everything. Instead of yielding to panic, I anchored myself. I brought to mind the brightest memory I had. A summer afternoon at the beach with my parents, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the sound of the waves. I clung to that feeling of calm and warmth, and I projected it outward, a shield of serenity against the cold pressure I felt. I waited. I focused on my breathing, on the beat of my heart, anchoring myself to reality. I offered it nothing. Not a scream, not a sob, not a tremor. Just my quiet presence. The figure stopped. I could feel its frustration, a cold anger emanating from it like a wave. The pressure in my mind increased, trying to break my defenses, searching for a crack of fear to slip through. But I held firm. It had been cut off from its food source. And in the silence of my mind, I no longer felt its power but its weakness. Without my fear, it was nothing. The presence began to recede, to dissolve. The glacial cold slowly dissipated. The feeling of being watched vanished. There was no scream, no explosion. It was simply gone. I waited in the dark for another hour, just to be sure. And for the first time in my life, the darkness didn't feel threatening. It was empty. It was peaceful. I've learned a lot since that night. I still live in the same apartment, but most of the lights are off. I've discovered a strange comfort in the gloom, in the soft contours the moonlight creates. My phobia hasn't disappeared entirely. It's a scar that will always be there, but it no longer controls me. I defeated it that night, not by fighting the darkness, but by accepting it. The man in the diary was right. There was a debt to be paid. The debt was my own fear. Sometimes the only way to defeat a monster isn't to flood it with light, but to stop being afraid of its shadows. I've learned that true power lies not in eliminating the darkness, but in finding the calm within it, knowing that even if you can't see what's there, you don't have to give it the power to scare you. For a trucker, the night is a different animal. The world shrinks to the cone of light from your headlights, and the entire universe is reduced to the cab of your truck. The asphalt is an endless black river, and the white lines are the only pulse reminding you that you're still moving forward. I had been living in that universe for 15 years. Solitude didn't scare me. It was my co-worker. The drone of the engine was my soundtrack. I knew every curve, every ghostly service area, every stretch of road where the radio gave up and only the hiss of static remained. My life was a predictable loop of miles and darkness, and I was comfortable in it. That October night, the road was blacker than usual. I was covering the route from Zaragoza to Huelva, a journey I'd made hundreds of times. After midnight, I found myself on a particularly desolate stretch in Extremadura, an endless straightaway flanked by nothingness. I hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour. The moon was a pale sliver hidden behind a layer of high clouds. The radio, as expected, only gave off a tortured hiss. I was alone, suspended between two distant points on a map. That's when I saw them. They didn't appear in the distance. They were simply there, floating over the road about a kilometer ahead. They weren't the lights of a car or a plane. They were 3 points of white light, arranged in a perfect triangle, completely motionless and in total silence. I instinctively slowed down, frowning. They didn't blink. Their light didn't illuminate the asphalt beneath them. They simply existed, cold and indifferent. As I got closer, a strange sensation began to creep over me. A low, almost inaudible vibration that I felt more in my bones than in my ears. And then, about 200 meters from the lights, everything died. The truck's engine choked without a single sound. The dashboard went dark in an instant. The radio fell silent. The silence was so sudden and so profound that it hurt. My truck, an 18-ton beast, glided down the road in a ghostly inertia, with no sound other than the tires on the asphalt. Panic seized me. I stomped on the brake, but the hydraulic system didn't respond. I turned the steering wheel, but it was completely stiff. The truck slowly came to a stop on its own, right underneath the 3 lights. I looked up through the windshield. They were directly above me, and I felt a pressure. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical force, like being at the bottom of an ocean, crushing me into my seat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw was the white light intensifying, filling the cab and erasing the world. Then nothing. Waking up was a jolt. A sharp, piercing pain behind my eyes brought me back to consciousness. I was slumped over the steering wheel. The inside of the cab was freezing. I blinked, disoriented. The truck's hazard lights were flashing rhythmically, casting an orange glow on the dead dashboard. Outside, it was still night. I sat up, my body aching and my mouth dry with a metallic taste on my tongue. I looked at my wristwatch, 4:15 in the morning. I looked at the digital clock on the dash, which had reset and was flashing 12 o'clock. I tried to remember. I was driving, I saw the lights, and then the void. I looked at my watch again. It was 1:10 when I saw the lights. I remembered because my favorite radio show was about to end. 3 hours and 5 minutes had passed. 3 hours that didn't exist in my memory. My mind, trained by years on the road and the logic of schedules and distances, searched for tangible proof. I opened the glove compartment and took out the tachograph disc, the device that legally records every minute of driving and rest. I pulled it out with trembling hands. The data was my Bible, the irrefutable proof of my work. But what I saw made no sense. The thin line drawn by the needle on the paper showed my normal driving until 110. Then the line simply vanished. It didn't mark a stop. It didn't mark a rest. For 3 hours and 5 minutes, there was nothing, a blank space, as if the truck and I had ceased to exist. At 4:15, the line reappeared abruptly, marking the vehicle as stopped with the hazard lights on. The paper didn't lie. 3 hours of my life had evaporated. That's when I saw it. On the back of my right hand, right where it had been resting on the steering wheel, there was a mark. It was a perfect equilateral triangle, the size of a small coin. It wasn't a cut or a scratch. The skin was slightly indented and smooth, a pale pink color, like an old scar. Yet it hadn't been there before. I touched it with the fingers of my other hand. I felt nothing. It was completely numb. I drove the rest of the way in a trance, fear and confusion battling inside me. I tried to find an explanation. I had fallen asleep. I had an incredibly vivid dream and, sleepwalking, had parked the truck and made the mark on myself somehow. Or maybe ball lightning, a strange weather phenomenon. But no explanation fit all the facts. The total electrical failure, the lights, the lost time, the perfect mark, and above all, the blank tachograph disc. I got home and tried to return to normal. I told my wife I'd felt unwell and had stopped to rest. I didn't mention anything else. How could I? The words felt ridiculous, taken from a bad science fiction movie. But normality had been broken. The scar on my hand was a constant reminder. And then the other changes began. A couple of nights later, I was in the backyard smoking a cigarette. I looked up at the sky out of habit, and an irrational, icy, paralyzing panic took hold of me. The stars, which had always seemed like silent companions on my journeys, suddenly looked like eyes. Millions of cold, distant eyes, watching me from an infinite abyss. The sky was no longer a ceiling. It was a thin veil, a one-way mirror. I felt a vulnerability so absolute that I had to run back inside, my heart pounding. I developed a phobia. I could no longer look at the night sky. Then came the humming. It started subtly. In moments of silence, when the house was quiet, I would hear a background noise, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from inside my own head. At first I thought it was tinnitus, an ear problem, but this was different. It was constant, structured. It was the sound of a distant machine. The nightmares soon followed. They were fragmented, disconnected. I didn't dream of lights or strange beings. I dreamed of pure, terrifying sensations. I dreamed I was lying on a metal surface so cold it burned, and that I was trying to scream but had no mouth. I dreamed of smells, an odor of ozone, like the air after a thunderstorm, mixed with something sweet and antiseptic. And I dreamed of sounds, a chorus of dry, guttural clicks that sounded like a language, filling the darkness. I would wake up soaked in sweat, with the feeling that these dreams weren't dreams but echoes. Echoes of those missing 3 hours. Paranoia settled in like a permanent fog. I felt watched. Sometimes in a crowded supermarket, I would feel a gaze fixed on me. But when I turned, no one was there. On the road, I became obsessed with the cars behind me, convinced they were following me. My wife began to notice my erratic behavior, my lack of sleep, my new habit of closing all the curtains as soon as night fell. She tried to talk to me, but I pushed her away. A chasm of silence grew between us, a silence that, for me, was filled with the incessant humming. I knew I was losing control, that I was sliding into a dark place. I tried to cling to logic, to routine. One night, after an argument with my wife, I locked myself in the bathroom. I needed to be alone. I needed to look myself in the face and convince myself that I was still me. I leaned on the sink, the water running, and looked up at the mirror. My reflection stared back at me. A tired face with dark circles under the eyes, the face of a frightened man. I forced myself to hold eye contact, to search for the man I was before, the calm trucker who wasn't afraid of anything. And then, for a second, something changed. It wasn't a blink. It was a shift in my reflection's gaze. The desperation and fear vanished from its eyes, replaced by a cold calm, an ancient and utterly alien intelligence. There was no emotion in that look, only a quiet assessment and an incomprehensible power. I felt as if a stranger had peered out through my own eyes. Terror paralyzed me. And in that same instant of absolute silence, the humming in my head stopped. And in its place, with perfect clarity, a voice that was not a voice, a thought that was not my own, resonated in my mind. It's almost time. I recoiled, slipping on the bath mat and falling to the floor. My own face, or the thing that had used my face, watched me from the mirror with a terrible calm. The thought kept echoing in my head, not as an echo, but as a freshly carved scar on my memory. It's almost time. I scrambled backward, away from the mirror, until my back hit the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image of that alien gaze was imprinted on the inside of my eyelids. There was no doubt anymore. I wasn't crazy. This wasn't the aftermath of trauma. There was something inside me. The terror of that night was different. It was no longer the fear of an external threat, of something lurking in the dark sky. The monster was in the house. It was inside the walls, inside my skull. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the living room sofa with all the lights on, trembling. I analyzed every thought that crossed my mind with panic. Was it mine, or was it the thing's? I tried to fight. I began to quietly recite the names of the streets of my childhood, the rosters of my favorite soccer teams, any memory that was undeniably mine, in a desperate attempt to fill my head with my own essence, to leave no room for the intruder. But it was useless. It was like shouting in an empty room. The other presence didn't respond. It was simply there. A cold, silent calm in a corner of my mind. I had become a stranger in my own mind. The days that followed were a descent into a new kind of hell. The passenger, as I began to call it, became more active. Lost time was no longer limited to traumatic events on lonely roads. Now it seeped into the most mundane moments of my life. One day I was in the kitchen, making coffee. I blinked. Suddenly, I was standing in the garage, holding a wrench, and my car's engine was cold. I had no idea how I had gotten there. There was a 5-minute gap in my life, and an icy chill ran through me as I realized that during that time, my hands, my legs, my body had been moving with a will that was not my own. My wife looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity. She found me one afternoon in my small study, standing in front of a notepad. I didn't remember sitting down to write, but the page was filled with symbols. They were complex, geometric diagrams, a kind of alien script drawn with my own handwriting, with an architect's precision that I, a simple trucker, was incapable of possessing. When she asked me what it was, I had no answer. I looked at the symbols and felt a horrible vertigo, as if I were peering over the edge of a cliff. The entity wasn't violent. It was methodical. I felt it was studying me, testing the limits of its control, like a pilot familiarizing himself with the controls of a new ship. I was the ship. And then, the impulse began. It started as a distant idea, a mental image that appeared unbidden, the endless straightaway on that road in Extremadura. At first I pushed it away angrily, but the idea returned, stronger and clearer each time. It began to turn into a craving, an almost physical need. My body felt the urge to be there, under that empty sky. I knew the desire wasn't mine. It belonged to the passenger. It wanted to go back. I fought against it with all my strength. I tried to anchor myself to reality, to my life. I focused on my wife, on the small details of our home. One day, she took my hands, her eyes filled with tears, and begged me to tell her what was wrong, to get help. As I looked at her, I felt the impulse with overwhelming force, a silent command in my head. The words I wanted to say to her were choked off. I stood up, released her hands with a gentleness that didn't belong to me, turned around, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she cried, her voice cracking with panic. I couldn't answer. My body no longer obeyed me. I took the car keys from the bowl by the entrance and left the house. She followed me, shouting my name, but I moved with a calm and determination that terrified me. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away, watching her in the rearview mirror, a shrinking, desperate figure in the doorway of our home. I was screaming too, but my scream was silent, trapped inside a mind I no longer ruled. The journey was the most terrifying experience of my life. For 8 hours, I was a prisoner inside my own body. My hands held the steering wheel firmly. My feet worked the pedals with pinpoint precision. My eyes never left the road. But I was not the driver. I was trapped behind my own eyes, watching helplessly as I headed toward my destination. The panic turned into a silent agony. I tried to fight with all the strength of my will. I focused on my right foot, ordering it to lift off the accelerator and hit the brake. But my leg was a leaden stranger, immune to my commands. I tried to scream, to open my mouth and call for help to the car that overtook us at one point, but my vocal cords didn't make a whisper. My hands gripped the wheel, and I fought to swerve, to crash the car into the median, to force an end before we reached that place. But my muscles were not mine. They belonged to a puppet, and I could only watch as my body betrayed me, kilometer by kilometer. The thing inhabiting me didn't need maps. It knew exactly where it was going. I arrived at dusk. The setting sun stained the sky a bloody orange. My body stopped the car on the same shoulder, at the exact spot where I had woken up weeks before. The engine shut off, and then it gave me back control. The driver's door opened, a silent invitation. I got out of the car, my legs trembling, but moving of my own volition. The compulsion was gone. In its place, there was an expectant calm. I stood by the car, looking at the darkening sky. The first stars began to appear. My phobia, my panic, had vanished. I only felt a cold resignation. I understood that I was not the guest of honor. I was the offering. I was the beacon that had guided the hosts to the party. And then they returned. Just like the first time, they didn't arrive from a distance. They simply appeared. The 3 white lights, silent, perfect, floating above the road. They descended slowly, and I felt that overwhelming pressure again, that vibration that seeped into my bones. But this time there was no fear. The passenger inside me stirred, not with panic, but with something akin to satisfaction. I closed my eyes. I waited for the end. I waited for them to take me, to disintegrate me, to end it. But none of that happened. The pressure intensified for a minute in which I felt every cell in my body vibrate in unison with the lights. I felt a flow, a transfer of information from my mind to them. It wasn't images or words. It was something more fundamental. Data, experiences, sensations. My life, my fears, my love for my wife, everything was being copied, downloaded. They were collecting the report from their probe. And as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure ceased. The lights rose vertically, without a sound, and vanished into the vastness of the sky. I was left alone in the darkness, in the middle of nowhere. The silence returned, but this time it was a real silence. The humming in my head was gone. The feeling of being watched, of having a passenger, had completely disappeared. I was alone. For the first time in weeks, I was truly alone in my own mind. The feeling was so overwhelming that I fell to my knees on the asphalt and wept. I drove back home, a slow, heavy journey. When I arrived, my wife was there, waiting for me. There were no questions. She just held me, and in that embrace I knew she'd stay by my side, even if she could never understand. My life, in a way, has returned to normal. I still drive my truck, but only during the day. The mark on my hand has faded until it's almost invisible. I'm no longer afraid of the night sky. But something broke forever that night. The certainty of being the sole owner of my own thoughts. The thing left, yes, but it left the door open. They gave me my body back, but my mind is a house a thief has broken into. Even after he's gone, you never stop checking the locks. I was abducted, but not in the way the stories tell. They didn't take my body, they took myself. They turned me into a vessel, into a pair of eyes and ears for something that couldn't or wouldn't walk among us. And now I live with the knowledge that the unknown universe isn't just out there, among the stars. Sometimes it can find a way in, make a nest in your head, and look at the world through its eyes. And that's the scar that never fades. The doubt as to whether every thought you have is, in fact, entirely your own.